The air was thick with dust and the faint metallic tang of anticipation as the sun climbed relentlessly over the sprawling plantation grounds. Men and women in worn linen, hats pulled low to shield against the glaring light, jostled for position near the auction block, their eyes scanning the rows of slaves lined up as if they were nothing more than livestock. This was not a place of honor or dignity. It was a place where wealth was measured in human bodies and where whispers of rumor could carry as much weight as the sound of a hammer striking the block. From the far end of the lot came a hush, sudden and almost imperceptible, as a carriage rolled into view, dust spiraling in lazy clouds in its wake. All chatter seemed to falter, replaced by a low hum of curiosity and unease. Inside, led by a solemn overseer, was a young woman whose presence seemed almost unnatural. Her skin glowed under the harsh sunlight, a soft golden hue that seemed to catch the light in a way that made the other slaves appear dull in comparison. Her eyes, dark and sharp, scanned the crowd, unflinching and unafraid, yet there was something in her gaze that made men step back and mutter under their breath. The plantation master, who had traveled here for business, a man of considerable pride and ambition, noticed her immediately. He had seen many slaves in his time, strong ones, clever ones, obedient ones, but none whose beauty seemed to command attention without effort. It wasn't just her face, though that was enough to stop the breath in a man's chest. It was the way she carried herself. She moved with a quiet dignity, her posture straight, her hands folded gently in front of her. Yet there was an almost imperceptible tension in the way she held her head, as if she were carrying a secret too heavy for her small frame. Whispers spread quickly, like wind rustling dry leaves. "She's cursed," one man muttered, leaning close to his neighbor. "No good comes from owning her," another added, crossing himself briefly before lowering his voice. Rumors of accidents, sudden illnesses, and strange happenings had followed her from plantation to plantation, and though none dared speak the details aloud, the weight of unspoken stories pressed on everyone present. Buyers hesitated, shifting uneasily on their heels, unsure if the allure of her beauty was worth the risk of whatever haunted her past. The plantation master's curiosity flared. He had never been a man to back down from a challenge, nor one to let superstition govern his actions. Yet as he studied her, he felt a strange pull, something both exhilarating and dangerous. Her eyes met his, and for a moment it was as though the world outside the auction block, the chatter, the sun, the dusty crowd, ceased to exist. In those dark depths he sensed intelligence, defiance, and a fire that had clearly been honed by years of suffering. She was more than a commodity. She was a puzzle. The auctioneer's voice cut through the thick tension like a whip. "Who will start the bidding?" he called, hammer in hand, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced urgency. But there was no immediate answer. The whispers continued, spreading from one hesitant bidder to the next. Each man considered his wealth, his reputation, and the ominous stories attached to her. Every raised eyebrow and sideways glance seemed to carry a warning. This was no ordinary slave, and any man foolish enough to bid might find himself paying a price far higher than gold. Finally, the plantation master stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth, a deliberate sound meant to assert control. He caught the eye of the auctioneer, whose practiced composure faltered slightly. "I'll start the bidding," the master said, his voice low but firm, carrying a confidence that seemed to ripple through the crowd. Heads turned, and murmurs swelled into an uneasy chorus. Some men scowled, resentful at his audacity. Others watched with barely concealed curiosity, eager to see what would unfold. The first bids were cautious, almost timid, as if the men feared the consequences of underestimating her. Yet each time a number was called, the silence seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as though the air itself were warning them away. It was as if the very ground beneath the auction block remembered the tragedies whispered about her name, and it resisted anyone who dared try to claim her. Still, the plantation master pressed on, raising his offers steadily, each increment met with quiet astonishment. No one dared match him, not out of fear alone, but because there was a sense deep and unsettling that he was walking into a story already written, one whose ending no one had survived to tell. As the hammer hovered, ready to declare him the winner, the young woman's expression remained calm. Her lips curved slightly in a ghost of a smile, though it was difficult to discern whether it was amusement, defiance, or resignation. Her calmness unnerved the bidders further, for in the face of fear and superstition, she stood unmoved, almost impervious. There was a subtle power in her quiet presence, a gravity that seemed to pull at the edges of the crowd's collective imagination. Even seasoned traders, men who had seen years of auctions and horrors, felt a shiver of something they could neither name nor explain. When the gavel finally struck, declaring the Plantation Master the purchaser of the most beautiful and most feared slave in the lot, the crowd let out a collective exhale. Some whispered of foolishness, others of inevitable doom. The auctioneer's voice echoed briefly, declaring the sale final, but beneath the official words lay a current of unease, a recognition that something far greater than mere commerce had just transpired. The Plantation Master, for all his pride, felt a thrill mingled with trepidation. He had won, yes, but at what cost? He could not shake the feeling that he had just unlocked a door that should have remained closed. As she was led toward him, the young woman's gaze never wavered. She studied him with a quiet curiosity, as though measuring the weight of his intentions, the depth of his ambition, and the cracks in his courage. In that moment he realized that the stories whispered by the other buyers might not have been exaggerations. There was a truth hidden in her history, a reason no one dared bid before him. But whether that truth was a warning or a trap, he could not yet tell. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the auction grounds. Dust swirled around their feet, and the murmurs of the crowd faded into the distance as the Plantation Master led her away. The auction was over, but the story was just beginning. Each step they took seemed to echo with the weight of the past, with the secrets buried in the slave's eyes and the mysteries that no man dared uncover. As they disappeared into the edge of the property, the tension in the air lingered like a living thing, a promise that what had started here on this sun-scorched block would not end quietly, and that every moment henceforth would be shaped by a history too dark to ignore. No one in that crowd would forget her, not her beauty, not her presence, not the haunting feeling that she carried a power beyond any man's comprehension. And as for the Plantation Master, he could not yet know that he had purchased more than a slave. He had purchased a story, one that would demand attention, courage, and perhaps a reckoning that no amount of gold could prevent. The auction block now stood empty, the echo of the gavel lingering like a ghost. The murmurs of warning and superstition faded into the distance, but for those who had witnessed the scene, the memory was etched indelibly. A beautiful, feared and mysterious figure had crossed into their lives, and the shadow of her presence would stretch far beyond that sun-baked ground. For the Plantation Master, the first steps toward possession were only the beginning of a journey he could not yet understand, a journey that would reveal secrets, test his courage, and uncover truths that had long been buried beneath the soil and the whispers of the past. Life on the plantation began in a way that seemed almost normal at first, though a faint tension lingered in the air like the calm before a storm. The Plantation Master walked beside her as she was shown to the quarters assigned to her, a modest cabin set apart from the others, near the edge of the property where the trees grew thick and shadows lingered long into the day. The sun, filtering through the branches, cast shifting patterns across the walls, as if the forest itself were watching, aware that something unusual had entered its domain. The young woman's gaze never wavered, taking in the surroundings with careful attention, measuring distances, angles, and obstacles, yet never once betraying fear or hesitation. The other slaves regarded her with a mixture of awe and unease. They had seen the master buy her at the auction, watched the way the crowd had recoiled in whispers, and understood without explanation that there was a reason no one had dared to bid before. Some tried to speak, offering polite greetings or cautious questions, but her responses were measured, precise, almost distant. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice carried an authority that seemed impossible for one so young and so slender. Whispers travelled fast among the workers. "She's not like us," they said. eyes darting toward her cabin, as if merely glancing her way might invite misfortune. "Be careful who you talk to," others added, "or the same fate may come for you." The plantation master, for his part, was both fascinated and frustrated. He wanted to know more, to understand the woman who had captured his attention and, it seemed, the attention of the unseen forces that haunted the property. Each day, as he observed her performing the tasks assigned, cleaning, cooking, tending to small repairs, he noticed details that unsettled him. Objects moved when she wasn't looking, minor accidents seemed to avoid her presence, and yet shadows shifted strangely around her, almost as if the sunlight itself hesitated near her. It was not long before small, inexplicable incidents began to accumulate. One morning, a prized horse bolted from the stable, panic spreading through the other animals as if fear itself had infected them. The plantation master rushed to the scene, only to find the young woman standing calmly near the fence, her hand outstretched as though she had been the one to stop the creature. She did not speak, but her eyes met his, and he could swear there was a subtle warning there. The world is not what you think it is. Other events were quieter, more insidious. Workers spoke in hushed tones of shadows moving in corners of rooms where no light should reach, of fleeting shapes at the edges of their vision, and of a chill that followed her like a second skin. One of the older slaves, a woman with skin creased by decades of toil, approached the master in private. She bowed her head, voice trembling with a mixture of respect and fear. "Sir," she said, "there is a history with her that you must know. That child, she is not ordinary. She carries something within her, a darkness and a power that has frightened more than one family." The master listened, a chill crawling along his spine, but he dismissed some of her words as superstition. Still, he could not ignore the feeling that something vital, something dangerous, hovered just beneath the surface. He watched the young woman closely, noting the way she moved with quiet precision, the way she seemed to notice everything and yet reveal nothing. It was as if she were a sentinel in a world that others only half understood, a being both human and something more enigmatic, something the plantation could not tame. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and shadows stretched long across the property, he decided to follow her after supper, curious about where she spent her hours when she was supposedly idle. He trailed at a distance, careful not to alert her, and observed her stepping into the woods near the edge of the plantation. The trees swallowed her whole, and yet he saw her move with a purpose, not like someone wandering aimlessly, but like someone guided by a deeper knowledge of the terrain. Strange symbols were etched into the bark of certain trees, markings that seemed ancient, worn by weather and time, but deliberate. She paused at each one, touching it lightly, whispering words he could not hear. Fear began to creep in, unbidden and insistent. He realized that he was witnessing something forbidden, something that the plantation itself seemed to acknowledge with silent dread. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling leaves in a way that sounded almost like warning, and for the first time the master understood why no one had dared bid on her at the auction. It was not merely superstition or cowardice, it was knowledge. Those who came before had known of the power she carried and the consequences of trying to claim her as property. As days turned into weeks, the young woman continued her tasks, but her presence brought subtle chaos in its wake. Crops that had been struggling thrived unexpectedly when she tended them, while objects left carelessly in her path were found broken or displaced without explanation. The other slaves, initially wary, began to keep their distance, sensing that her world was not theirs to enter. Even the plantation master, once confident and in control, felt the walls of his understanding shrink. There was a force here, quiet and patient, that could not be ignored. One night, a storm rolled over the plantation, lightning cutting the sky with jagged fury and rain hammering the roof in relentless sheets. The master awoke to the sound of movement outside his quarters, assuming the worst, a thief, an animal, or perhaps the slave herself wandering in defiance. But when he opened the door, he found her standing at the edge of the flooded fields, arms raised as though commanding the wind. The water around her swirled unnaturally, reflecting the lightning in fractured patterns, and he could see the trees bending slightly, as if bowing to her presence. She did not notice him watching. She was focused entirely on whatever invisible force she commanded. From that moment, fear and fascination mingled in the master's mind. The whispers of the other slaves became clearer, the half-told stories of curses and accidents more credible. He began to understand that the auction had been a test of sorts, and he had walked straight into it. What he had bought was not a mere servant or companion, it was a living enigma, a being whose existence challenged the natural order of the plantation and perhaps even the world he thought he understood. Rumors among the neighboring plantations began to spread, carried by the wary travelers and traders who had attended the auction. Men spoke of the young woman with reverence and dread, of the master who had dared to claim her, and of the strange occurrences that followed him like shadows. Some claimed that anyone who tried to speak ill of her or harm her mysteriously vanished, while others whispered that she had the ability to see into the future, predicting calamities before they struck. These stories only reinforced the isolation and tension at the plantation, as everyone realized that the master had brought not just beauty and skill into his home, but a force that no one could control. The young woman, for her part, never overtly displayed power. She worked, she walked, she ate, she slept, but always with a sense of purpose that unsettled those around her. She understood her own presence, her own influence, and she wielded it with quiet discretion, letting the world around her respond in subtle, terrifying ways. Her silence became a shield, her gaze a weapon, and her beauty a lure that drew in the unsuspecting, only to remind them of their own fragility. As the weeks passed, the plantation master wrestled with an uneasy fascination. He was both drawn to her and wary of her, caught between desire and fear. He questioned himself constantly. Had he purchased a gift or a curse? Could he claim loyalty and obedience from someone who seemed inherently untamable? And yet, no matter how much he watched or tried to understand, she remained a mystery, a force of nature disguised as a human being. In private moments, he observed her at the edge of the woods, tending to plants, tracing symbols on trees, or simply standing still as the wind and rain seemed to obey her will. Each instance left him with more questions than answers, and a gnawing sense of dread that perhaps the stories were not exaggerations. The other slaves began to speak less, their caution evolving into fear, and even the animals seemed to recognize a difference in her presence. It was as if the land itself acknowledged her, bending to a power that had existed long before the plantation and would persist long after the master had gone. By the end of the first month, it was clear that life on the plantation had been irrevocably altered. The young woman had become a central figure, not merely in the daily operations but in the undercurrent of tension and fear that gripped everyone who lived and worked there. She had arrived quietly, her history unspoken, her presence enigmatic, and yet she had made herself impossible to ignore. The whispers, the warnings, the small, unexplainable events, they all painted a picture of someone far more than ordinary, someone whose past and abilities had kept her untouched by the cruelty and exploitation that had ensnared so many others. And so the plantation master found himself in a precarious position, the owner of a slave whose power and mystery defied reason, whose presence commanded both awe and fear, and whose story was only beginning to unfold. He had stepped into a world that was darker, deeper, and far more dangerous than he could have imagined, and the realization that he might be in over his head settled like a stone in his chest. Yet despite everything, he could not look away, could not stop wondering what lay behind the calm exterior, what secrets she carried, and what destiny had brought her to his doorstep, waiting for him to discover it. Life on the plantation settled into a rhythm that was deceptively ordinary, yet beneath the surface, tension and unease festered like embers waiting to ignite. The young woman, whose arrival had sent ripples of fear through the auction crowd, now moved among the slaves with an almost ethereal presence. She carried out her tasks with quiet precision, sweeping, scrubbing, cooking, and mending clothes with a grace that made her work seem effortless, almost ceremonial. The other slaves observed her from a distance, careful to avoid drawing her attention, and whispered, amongst themselves in low, urgent tones. It was not only her beauty that set her apart, it was the sense of control she exuded, a subtle command over the world around her that was impossible to ignore. The plantation master watched her constantly, both fascinated and increasingly unsettled. At first he tried to maintain a sense of authority, giving orders, expecting obedience, and asserting his control as he had with every other slave he owned. But with her the rules seemed to bend. She performed tasks not only efficiently, but in ways that subtly disrupted the expected order, forcing him to confront his assumptions about dominance and power. Objects that had been misplaced for days were suddenly found in their proper place without anyone admitting to moving them. Crops that were beginning to wilt thrived under her touch. Their growth accelerated as though responding to some unseen encouragement. Animals that were normally skittish approached her calmly, following her like shadows, sensing a presence they could not articulate. Other slaves began to grow uneasy as well, some whispering of magic, others of divine favor, but all recognizing that this young woman viewed as different. She did not speak openly of her past, and when pressed, her answers were vague, measured, and impossible to read. There was a sharp intelligence behind her dark eyes, a mind that calculated and observed far more than it revealed. The plantation master began to notice that her silence was not empty, it was deliberate, a tool wielded as skillfully as any blade. And the more he observed, the more he realized that her presence changed the very dynamics of the plantation. Even mundane interactions became charged with tension. One afternoon, a servant tripped while carrying a basket of food, spilling its contents across the floor. The young woman had been walking past and paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. The air seemed to still, the sound of the birds cut abruptly, and even the wind seemed to hesitate. When the servant looked up, the basket was upright, food neatly arranged as though nothing had happened. The servant staggered back, eyes wide with fear and confusion, and the plantation master felt a chill crawl up his spine. It was a simple act, yet it carried an almost supernatural weight, a demonstration of power so subtle that it could easily be dismissed as coincidence, yet it was impossible to ignore once witnessed. She began to establish her own patterns on the plantation, her movements almost ritualistic. At dawn, she would rise before the rest of the household, stepping barefoot through the dew-soaked grass, tracing paths that seemed purposeful and deliberate. 8. Shadows clung to her like followers, bending unnaturally around her as she walked. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words held the weight of authority, causing even the most confident workers to pause and listen. The master, who prided himself on control and understanding, began to feel the limits of his power. This was not a slave he could command. This was a force he could observe, but never fully grasp. Strange occurrences became more frequent. Tools left out of place were discovered back in their proper locations. Letters and notes that had been mislaid appeared exactly where she intended them to be. Even the weather seemed to respond to her presence in subtle ways, a sudden gust of wind clearing clouds, or a soft drizzle beginning and ending with uncanny precision. The other slaves treated these events as omens, either of protection or warning, and the master's pride and rationality struggled to reconcile with what he observed. He began to question whether he had truly purchased a human being, or whether he had unknowingly claimed something far older and more powerful, something that obeyed rules of its own. Rumors began to spread beyond the plantation gates. Traders, travelers, and neighboring plantation owners whispered of the mysterious young woman, of the effects she seemed to have on everything around her, and of the growing unease of her master. Men spoke of things they could not explain, animals behaving strangely, plants thriving in impossible conditions, and servants who dared not speak freely for fear of unseen consequences. Some claimed she was protected by a spirit or a curse, others that she carried knowledge and power beyond human comprehension. These stories only served to isolate the plantation further, creating a bubble of tension in which every action, every movement was measured and observed. Despite the unease, the young woman maintained a quiet dignity. She did not flaunt her influence, nor did she seek to dominate overtly. Instead, she worked silently, her presence a constant reminder that she was both part of the world and apart from it. Her beauty, which had initially drawn the Master's attention, became secondary to the aura of control and subtle power she exuded. She was a puzzle, a force of nature that could not be contained, and the Plantation Master found himself both captivated and increasingly aware of his own vulnerability. One evening, as twilight settled over the plantation, he observed her standing at the edge of the fields, her figure framed by the dying light. The wind caught her hair, and her eyes, dark and unreadable, reflected the fading sun like molten glass. In that moment, he realized that everything he had believed about dominance and ownership was an illusion. She did not belong to him in the way any other slave had. She existed on her own terms, and the world bent subtly to her presence. He felt a mixture of awe, fear, and desire, emotions he had never fully experienced, and he understood that she had already claimed a form of power over him, one he had not been prepared to confront. Her interactions with the other slaves became a study in subtle authority. She corrected mistakes not with anger, but with precision, guiding hands, adjusting posture, and even using silent gestures to convey her will. Others began to respond instinctively, recognizing that resistance was futile, yet unable to articulate the nature of her influence. It was as if she operated according to a set of rules known only to her, a code that she did not reveal but that everyone felt in every fiber of their being. As the seasons changed, the Master noticed that the plantation itself seemed to transform under her presence. Crops flourished beyond expectations, minor disputes among the workers dissolved without explanation, and even the animals seemed calmer, more orderly. It was as though the young woman carried a balance, an energy that reshaped the environment subtly yet irrevocably. He began to understand, with a mixture of fear and respect, that he had not purchased a mere servant. He had purchased a being whose existence challenged the very order of the world he knew, someone whose power was both quiet and absolute, and whose presence would shape the plantation in ways he could neither predict nor control. Despite her quiet influence, the young woman remained enigmatic. She spoke little of her past, never revealed her thoughts in full, and moved with a deliberate patience that suggested she had seen far more than anyone could imagine. The Master, once confident in his understanding of human behavior and the hierarchies of power, felt increasingly powerless. Every attempt to assert authority, every expectation that she would conform, was met with subtle resistance, not overt defiance, but a quiet reminder that she operated by rules he could not grasp. The Plantation Master found himself caught in a delicate balance of fascination and fear. He admired her intelligence, her grace, her ability to command without words, yet he could not ignore the nagging suspicion that her presence carried consequences he could not yet understand. Shadows seemed longer near her, and the air carried a weight that could not be measured, a sense that the land itself acknowledged her authority. He realized that life on the plantation would never return to the ordinary rhythms he once knew. She had reshaped the world subtly, invisibly, and irrevocably, asserting a presence that was impossible to deny. The other slaves began to look to her, not just for guidance but for protection, recognizing that her influence extended beyond simple human understanding. She had become the quiet center of the plantation, a figure whose power and mystery commanded respect, obedience, and awe. Even the Master, whose pride and ambition had driven him to purchase her, understood that he was no longer the sole authority. Her subtle power had redefined the hierarchy, placing her in a positio that was both impossible to challenge and impossible to ignore. In the stillness of the night, when the world seemed to pause, the Master would sometimes watch her from the shadows, marveling at the quiet authority she wielded. She moved through the darkness with the same grace and precision as in the daylight, her eyes reflecting the moonlight, her presence reshaping the space around her. He understood, with a growing sense of both dread and fascination, that he had entered into a relationship with someone far beyond his comprehension, someone whose secrets, power, and intent remained hidden, yet whose influence was undeniable. And so, life on the plantation continued, charged with an unspoken tension. The young woman worked, observed, and moved with quiet authority, subtly shaping the world around her. The master, once confident and unchallenged, found himself in awe of her presence, unsure whether he was witnessing a gift, a curse, or both. The plantation itself seemed to respond to her in ways that defied reason, bending subtly under her influence, while the other slaves watched with a mixture of fear, reverence, and silent gratitude. It became clear that she was not merely a human being in the eyes of those who observed her. She was a force, a presence that demanded attention, respect, and caution. Her beauty was secondary to the power she carried, an influence so subtle that it could not be measured, yet so undeniable that no one could ignore it. The master understood that he had acquired something far greater than a servant, far beyond his comprehension, and that life on the plantation would never be the same. Every day, every task, every interaction carried the weight of her presence, and the plantation master began to realize that he was not merely her owner. He was a witness to a story, a mystery, and a force that would shape his world in ways he could not predict. Days and nights passed in a strange rhythm on the plantation, a rhythm dictated not by the sun or the seasons, but by the subtle presence of the young woman. The plantation master found himself constantly observing her, trying to read the hints she left, the small gestures that suggested there was more to her than met the eye. Every day the tension grew, not in an explosive way, but as a slow, pressing weight that settled in his chest. He began to notice details he had previously overlooked, the way the other slaves avoided certain paths when she walked, the way animals reacted to her presence, the faint murmur of wind that seemed to follow her. Then, one evening, as the sky bled red from the setting sun, the truth began to reveal itself in ways he could no longer ignore. A fire had broken out in one of the barns, sparked perhaps by a lantern knocked over carelessly by a laborer. Smoke coiled into the sky, thick and choking, and the master ran toward the flames, fearing for his property, for the lives of the slaves, for his reputation. But when he arrived, the young woman was already there, standing at the edge of the barn, her hand raised slightly as if gesturing to an unseen conductor. The fire leapt and danced as if in response to her, flames twisting unnaturally, refusing to spread beyond certain walls. The master froze, watching in a mixture of awe and terror as the barn itself seemed to bend to her will. It was then that he understood. This was the reason no one had dared to bid on her at the auction. It was not mere superstition, nor idle gossip. She was a being whose influence went beyond the ordinary bounds of human power. Her abilities were subtle yet undeniable, a combination of intelligence, perception, and something else, something ancient and unquantifiable that allowed her to shape events around her. Objects obeyed her will, accidents avoided her, even the elements seemed to respond to her presence. It was not malevolence that she carried, at least not yet. It was control, a force that could be wielded for protection or destruction. The master approached cautiously, his pride warring with fear. What are you?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his attempts at authority. The young woman turned to him, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. There was no malice in her gaze, but a quiet intensity that seemed to pierce through his very understanding. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she lowered her hand, the flames receding as naturally as if they had never risen. The barn, damaged but intact. Wah! A testament not to luck, but to deliberate control. "Do you see now?" she asked finally, her voice soft yet commanding. "This is why no one dared bid on me. Not because of fear of me alone, but because of the truth behind me. I have always been more than what you imagine. And those who try to claim me without understanding that do not survive the lesson." He staggered back, the weight of her words pressing on him. The stories he had heard, the whispers at the auction, the strange incidents among the other plantations, were all true. She carried with her a legacy, a force, a history that had kept her safe through years of cruelty, fear, and exploitation. And now, he realized with a cold shiver, he was in her world. a world where his authority meant nothing, where wealth and power could not protect him from the consequences of underestimating her. She led him away from the barn, moving with a confidence that made him feel both vulnerable and captivated. The air around them seemed charged, the distant trees swaying as if in acknowledgement of her presence. As they walked, she began to reveal pieces of her history, not in the form of direct confessions, but through small demonstrations and cryptic stories that hinted at the depth of her abilities. She spoke of her family, of powers passed down through generations, of knowledge and rituals that had been hidden from the eyes of those who sought only to enslave or control her. Each revelation came with a demonstration, a bra. Inch snapped underfoot, yet she lifted her hand, and it floated back into place, twisting unnaturally until it was as if nothing had happened. A lantern, knocked over in haste, righted itself without a sound. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying away the smoke of the fire in a perfect spiral, as if obedient to her command. The Plantation Master's heart raced, each act of control overwhelming him with the stark realization that he had no understanding of the forces he was dealing with. It was not malevolence that unsettled him most, it was the inevitability of her power. She could have chosen destruction at any moment, yet she did not. Every display of control, every bending of the environment was precise, deliberate, and restrained. She had the ability to reshape events in ways that would make him appear foolish or powerless, yet she chose to temper her influence, teaching him, testing him, rather than punishing him outright. The other slaves observed these events from the shadows, their fear mingling with awe. They whispered that she was protected by spirits, by knowledge, by forces older than the plantation, older than any man alive. And in the master's mind the realization crystallized. He had not purchased a mere slave, he had brought into his home a being who carried with her a legacy that was both dangerous and extraordinary. Every step, every glance, every gesture she made reinforced the truth. The auction had not been a simple transaction. It had been a choice, a chal, leng, and he had accepted it without fully understanding the stakes. As night fell, they returned to the main house, the Plantation Master struggling to reconcile his fascination with his growing fear. He realized that he had been naive, that his wealth and authority meant nothing in the face of her abilities. She was not a commodity, not an object to be controlled. She was a force, a presence that demanded respect, understanding, and caution. And yet, despite the fear, there was a strange allure. He could not look away, could not stop trying to understand her, to probe the limits of her knowledge and power. Over the following days, the revelations continued. Objects moved subtly under her influence, accidents were prevented before they occurred, and the other slaves found themselves instinctively following her lead. She taught them through example, through quiet demonstrations of authority, and through subtle guidance that required observation and intuition. The master, despite himself, began to learn, not only of her abilities but of the delicate balance she maintained between power and restraint, between dominance and justice. One evening, he found her standing at the edge of the fields, staring into the distance as if reading events invisible to ordinary eyes. He approached cautiously, unsure whether his presence would be welcomed or punished. She turned to him, her gaze steady and knowing. "Do you understand now?" she asked. "Do you see why no one dared claim me?" He could only nod, speechless, the enormity of the truth pressing down upon him. She had survived, endured, and thrived precisely because of the power she wielded, and because the world had never dared challenge her without consequence. Her revelations were not just warnings, they were lessons. Each display of control, each cryptic story, each subtle manipulation of the world around her was a demonstration of the depth of her history and the inevitability of her influence. The master began to understand that life on the plantation would never be the same. He was no longer in charge, he was an observer, a participant in a story far larger than his own ambitions, and he knew, with a growing sense of dread and awe, that every decision he made would be shadowed by her presence, every movement measured against the quiet, unyielding force she represented. The nights became restless, The master found himself haunted by what he had seen, replaying events in his mind, trying to rationalize what could not be explained. The young woman's calm control, her deliberate authority, and the almost supernatural precision of her actions left him questioning everything he thought he knew about the world. He began to understand that he had been drawn into a narrative that stretched beyond the plantation, beyond the auction, and beyond the ordinary limits of human experience. And yet, despite the fear, despite the awe, he could not turn away. He watched her work, observed her interactions with the slaves and the land, and tried in small ways to anticipate her actions. He realized that she had not just revealed herself to him, she had revealed the fragile illusion of his own control, the limits of his understanding, and the necessity of humility in the face of forces far greater than himself. The revelation of her secret reshaped the plantation itself. The crops, the animals, the other slaves, all responded to the quiet authority she wielded. The master came to understand that she was not only a keeper of knowledge and power, but also a guardian of balance, a being whose presence maintained harmony in ways invisible to ordinary eyes. And he realized that the auction, the bidding, and his victory had been a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire plantation. By the time the full scope of her power was clear, the master knew that he had entered a pact of sorts. Ownership was an illusion, understanding, observation, and respect were the true currency. Every interaction with her carried weight, every decision required care, and every moment was a lesson in the limits of human authority. He had purchased beauty, yes, but what he truly acquired was a force of nature, a living enigma whose history, abilities, and influence would shape his life and the lives of all those on the plantation forever. Life on the plantation had changed in ways that were subtle yet irrevocable. The master, once confident and commanding, now moved through the estate with a sense of caution. Aware of every glance, every shadow, every movement that might reveal the young woman's attention, she had become the unseen force that shaped the plantation's rhythm, the quiet, invisible hand that determined outcomes before they happened. Workers tread lightly in her presence, animals followed her instinctively, and the land itself seemed to respond to her movements, bending to her will without the master understanding how. He began to realize that the auction, the bidding, and his moment of triumph had been the beginning of a story far larger than he could have imagined. He was no longer the center of power, he was merely a participant in the narrative she had long been writing before he even arrived. The other slaves treated her with a mixture of reverence and fear. They respected her authority because they had seen the consequences of failing to do so, yet they were also drawn to her for protection, guidance, and the quiet wisdom she carried. Unlike any master they had known, she did not enforce obedience with whip or shout. Her power was silent but absolute, demonstrated through her actions, her presence, and the unspoken influence she wielded over the world around her. Workers whispered that her eyes could see through deception, that her hands could guide the course of events, and that even nature itself obeyed her in ways they could not comprehend. The plantation had become a living testament to her presence, shaped by her unseen hand, and every moment carried the weight of her subtle, unyielding influence. The plantation master struggled with this reality. Pride and fear warred within him, creating an uneasy tension that never left his chest. He could not dominate her, could not fully understand her, and yet he found himself drawn to her in ways that went beyond desire. There was a fascination, a compulsion, as though understanding her, observing her, and even challenging her in small ways was both dangerous and irresistible. He realized that she had become the axis upon which the plantation now turned, and that his own authority, once absolute, was now measured in relation to her control, her awareness, and her judgment. Strange events continued to ripple across the plantation. A horse would fall into a rut that had been invisible to the eye but was instantly avoided when she walked near. Crops flourished in unlikely patches, responding to her touch as though she coaxed life from the earth itself. Minor disputes among workers resolved themselves silently, as if her presence alone enforced harmony, and yet there was a weight to her power that unsettled the master. It was not just the outcomes themselves, but the inevitability of them. He began to sense that she could shape events before they occurred, that she carried foresight or insight into forces beyond ordinary human understanding. Every step, every gesture, every glance was deliberate, calculated, and purposeful. Rumors beyond the plantation's borders grew louder. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of the young woman with unearthly abilities, of the master who had dared to claim her, and of the strange incidents that followed her like shadows. Some claimed she had been touched by spirits or forces older than the land itself, while others insisted she carried knowledge that could not be acquired by ordinary men. These stories spread fear and awe alike, isolating the plantation in a bubble of tension and mystery. Those who entered its gates could not ignore the sense that the land itself had changed, that something extraordinary walked among the humans, and that her influence was the force behind it. The master, despite himself, found moments of admiration creeping into his fear. Shh! He watched her work, noting the elegance of her movements, the precision with which she guided events, and the quiet authority that defined her every action. Yet admiration was inseparable from trepidation. He understood that any misstep, any misunderstanding of her power could have consequences beyond prediction. He was learning that her influence was not arbitrary, it was governed by rules and knowledge he could not hope to grasp fully. Yet he sensed that she was fair in her own measure, never harming without cause, but always ensuring that her authority was respected. Over time, he also began to notice subtle lessons she imparted to him. She did not speak them directly, but through observation he learned humility, patience, and awareness. She demonstrated that power need not be loud to be absolute, that influence could be wielded through quiet authority, and that understanding came not from force but from careful attention. He realized that his previous concept of control through wealth, status, and intimidation was inadequate in her presence. To survive, to maintain any semblance of influence, he would need to learn her rules, her boundaries, and the depth of her insight. The plantation itself became a reflection of her presence. Animals moved in strange harmony, crops grew with astonishing vigor, and even the weather seemed to respond subtly to her gestures. Workers began to intuitively understand her methods, adjusting their own behavior to complement her influence. In essence, she had transformed the plantation into a living extension of her will, a complex, self-regulating ecosystem in which she was both observer and conductor. The master saw the beauty of this transformation, yet he could not shake the unease that came with realizing how little he truly understood the world he inhabited. The young woman's influence extended beyond practical matters. Her presence reshaped relationships, hierarchies, and power dynamics on the plantation. Conflicts dissolved before they could escalate. Alliances shifted naturally, and fear and respect combined to create an unspoken social order. The master, once the unquestioned authority, now navigated a complex web in which her guidance, subtle or implied, determined outcomes. He began to understand that her power was not only extraordinary, it was necessary, keeping order and balance in a system that had long relied on cruelty and fear, but which she now governed through intelligence, observation, and an almost preternatural authority. Despite his growing understanding, the master could not fully anticipate her actions. She remained an enigma, capable of inspiring awe and fear simultaneously. One evening, during a particularly violent storm, he witnessed her influence in full effect. Rain fell in torrents, wind howled through the trees, and lightning split the sky in jagged flashes. Yet she moved calmly through the chaos, her hands raised subtly, guiding events. A tree that might have fallen avoided nearby structures. A trapped animal was freed without harm, and a worker who had panicked found himself guided instinctively to safety. The master watched, astonished and terrified, as she orchestrated survival without a word, without overt intervention, and with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. Her authority became absolute in the eyes of the plantation. She was both feared and respected, not through intimidation but through demonstration. Every action she took reinforced the understanding that she existed in a space that was beyond ordinary comprehension. Workers deferred to her silently, animals responded instinctively, and even the land itself seemed to shift subtly in acknowledgement of her presence. The master came to realize that she was the true force behind every element of the plantation, a being whose presence dictated outcomes in ways that he could neither control nor resist. Yet there was also a strange sense of justice in her influence. She did not harm without cause, nor did she act arbitrarily. Her interventions were measured, precise, and often preventative, stopping accidents or conflicts before they escalated. She had the power to destroy, yet she chose restraint, teaching those around her that authority need not be exercised through fear alone. The master, despite his initial pride and arrogance, began to learn from her example, understanding that true power lay in observation, discretion, and careful action rather than brute force. Her beauty. Why, once the initial reason he had been drawn to her, became secondary to the respect she commanded. She was no longer simply a slave, no longer merely a human presence on the plantation. She was a force, a guardian, a subtle arbiter whose influence shaped every aspect of life. The master realized that he had been wrong to think of ownership as absolute. He had not purchased a commodity. He had become part of a story, a living narrative in which she was the central figure, and in which every action he took was measured against her presence, her knowledge, and her judgment. As the years passed, the master's understanding deepened, though never fully. He learned to respect her authority, to observe and anticipate, to act with caution and humility. The plantation thrived under her guidance, not merely because of her supernatural abilities, but because of the balance she imposed through intelligence, observation, and quiet command. The other slaves flourished as well, understanding that her power was protective as much as it was absolute. Life continued, charged with the tension of her presence, but also enriched by the structure and stability she provided. And yet, for all the order she imposed, there remained an aura of mystery. No one could fully comprehend the extent of her abilities, the depth of her history, or the full measure of her influence. The master, though wiser and more cautious, could only observe, learning lessons that were at once frightening and enlightening. He had entered a world where power was not defined by wealth, authority, or fear, but by subtlety, foresight, and an understanding of forces beyond ordinary perception. In the end, the plantation became a living testament to her presence. Action, every decision, every moment carried the imprint of her influence. The master understood that he had been forever changed, that life on the plantation would never return to the way it had been, and that the young woman he had once thought to own was, in truth, the force that governed every aspect of his world. Fear, respect, awe, and fascination intertwined in every glance, every gesture, every day. And the story of her arrival, her power, and the subtle chaos she orchestrated would echo long after his own understanding had faded. The plantation, once a place of predictable routine and harsh authority, had become a living story of control, influence, and subtle power. The young woman had not only survived the auction, the master, and the whispers of fear, she had reshaped the entire world around her, a quiet force whose presence commanded obedience, respect, and reverence without ever raising her voice. And in that quiet dominance lay the ultimate lesson that true power, subtle, patient, and deliberate, was not claimed by force, but recognized by those wise enough to see it.